Swann's Way, In Search of Lost Time, Volume 1, by Marcel Proust. Combray 1. Overture. For a long time I went to bed early. Sometimes when I had put out my candle, my eyes would close so quickly that I had not even time to say, "I'm going to sleep." And half an hour later, the thought that it was time to go to sleep would awaken me. I would try to put away the book which I imagined was still in my hands, and to blow out the light. I had been thinking all the time, while I was asleep, of what I had been reading, but my thoughts had run into a channel of their own, until I myself seemed actually to have become the subject of my book. A church, a quartet, the rivalry between Francois I and Charles V. This impression would persist for some moments after I was awake. It did not disturb my mind, but it lay like scales on my eyes and prevented them from registering the fact that the candle was no longer burning. Then it would begin to seem unintelligible, as the thoughts of a former existence must be to a reincarnate spirit. The subject of my book would separate itself from me, leaving me to choose whether I would form part of it or not. And at the same time, my sight would return, and I would be astonished to find myself in a state of darkness, pleasant and restful enough for the eyes, and even more perhaps for my mind, to which it appeared incomprehensible, without a cause, a matter dark indeed. I would ask myself what time it could be. I could hear the whistling of trains, which now nearer and now farther off, punctuating the distance like the note of a bird in a forest, showed me in perspective the deserted countryside through which a traveller would be hurrying toward the nearest station, the path that he followed being fixed forever in his memory by his general excitement. Due to being in a strange place, to doing unusual things, to the last words of conversation, to farewells exchanged beneath an unfamiliar lamp that echoed still in his ears amid the silence of the night, and to my delightful prospect of being once again at home. I would lay my cheeks gently against the soft cheeks of my pillow, as plump and blooming as the cheeks of childhood. Or I would strike a match to look at my watch. Nearly midnight, the hour when an invalid who has been obliged to start on a journey and to sleep in a strange hotel awakens in a moment of illness and sees with glad relief a streak of daylight showing under his bedroom door. What joy! It is already morning. The servants, his bedroom door, will be about in a minute. He can ring, and someone will come to look after him. The thought of being made comfortable gives him strength to endure his pain. He is certain he heard footsteps. They come nearer and then die away. The ray of light beneath his door is extinguished. It is midnight. Someone has turned out the gas. The last servant has gone to bed, and he must lie all night in agony, with no one to bring him any help. I would go back to sleep, and often I would be awake again, for short snatches only, just long enough to hear the regular creaking of the wainscot, or to open my eyes to settle the shifting kaleidoscope of the darkness, to savor in an instantaneous flash of perception the sleep that lay heavy on the furniture, the room, the whole surroundings of which I formed but an insignificant part, and whose unconsciousness I would soon, very soon, return to share. Or perhaps, while I was asleep, I had returned without the least effort to an earlier stage in my life, now forever outgrown, and had come under the thrall of one of my childish terrors, such as that old terror of my great-uncle's pulling my curls, which was dispelled on the day, the dawn of a new era to me, on which they were finally cropped from my head. I had forgotten that event during my sleep. I remembered it again as soon as I had succeeded in making myself wake up to escape my great-uncle's fingers. Still, as a measure of precaution, I would bury the whole of my head in the pillow before returning to the world of dreams. Sometimes, too, just as Eve was created from a rib of Adam, so a woman would come into existence while I was sleeping, conceived from some strain in the position of my limbs, formed by the pleasure that I was on the point of enjoying. She it was, I imagine, who offered me that gratification. My body, conscious that its own warmth was permeating hers, would strive to become one with her, and I would awake. The rest of humanity seemed very remote in comparison with this woman, whose company I had left but a moment ago. My cheek was still warm with her kiss, my body bent beneath the weight of hers. If, as would sometimes happen, she had appearance of some woman whom I'd known in waking hours, I would abandon myself altogether to the sole quest of her. Like people who set out on a journey to see with their own eyes some city that they have always longed to visit and imagine they can taste in reality what has charmed their fancy. And then, gradually, the memory of her would dissolve and vanish, until I had forgotten the girl of my dream. When a man is asleep, he holds a circle around him, the chain of the hours, the sequence of the years, and the order of the universe. Instinctively, when he awakes, he looks to these, and in an instant reads off his own position on the earth's surface, and the amount of time that has elapsed during his slumbers. But this ordered procession is apt to grow confused, and to break its ranks. Suppose that, toward morning, after a night of insomnia, sleep descends on him while he is reading, in quite a different position from that in which he normally goes to sleep. He has only to lift his arm to arrest the sun, and turn it back in its course, and at the moment of waking, he will have no idea of the time, but will conclude that he has just gone to bed. Or suppose that he gets drowsy in some even more abnormal position, sitting in an armchair, say, after dinner. Then the world will fall topsy-turvy from its orbit. The magic chair will carry him at full speed through time and space. And when he opens his eyes again, he will imagine that he went to sleep months earlier and in some far distant country. But for me it was enough, if, in my own bed, my sleep was deep and relaxed, my mind entirely, for then I lost all sense of the place in which I had gone to sleep. And when I awoke at midnight, not knowing where I was, I could not be sure at first who I was. I had only the most rudimentary sense of existence, such as might lurk and flicker in the depths of an animal's consciousness. I was more destitute of human qualities than the cave dweller. But then the memory, not yet of the place in which I was, but of various other places where I had lived, and might now very possibly be, would come like a rescue from on high to draw me up out of the abyss of not being, from which I could never have escaped by myself. In a flash I would traverse and surmount centuries of civilization, and out of a half-visualized succession of oil lamps, followed by shirts with turned-down collars, would put together by degrees the component parts of myself. Perhaps the immobility of the things that surround us is forced on them by our conviction that they are themselves and not anything else, and by the immobility of our conceptions of them. For it always happens that when I awoke like this, and my mind struggled in an unsuccessful attempt to discover where I was, everything would be moving around me through the darkness, things, places, years. My body, still too heavy with sleep to move, would make an effort to construe the form that its tiredness took, as an orientation of its various members, so as to conclude from that where the wall lay and the furniture stood, to piece together and to give a name to the house in which it must be living. Its memory, the composite memory of its ribs, knees, and shoulders, offered it a whole series of rooms in which it had one time or another slept, while the unseen walls kept changing, adapting themselves to the shape of each successive room that it remembered, whirling through the darkness. And even before my brain, lingering consideration of when things had happened and of what they had looked like, had collected sufficient impressions to enable it to identify the room, it, my body, would recall from each room in succession what the bed was like, where the doors were, how daylight came in the windows, whether there was a corridor outside, what I had had in my mind when I went to sleep, and had found there when I awoke. The stiff inside underneath my body would, for instance, in trying to fix its position, imagine itself to be lying, face to the wall, in a big bed with a canopy. And at once I would say to myself, why, I must have gone to sleep after all, even though Mamma never came to say good night, for I was in the country with my grandfather who died years ago. And my body, the side on which I was lying, faithful guardians of a past that my mind would never have forgotten, brought back before my eyes the glimmering flame of the nightlight in its bowl of Bohemian glass, shaped like an urn and hung by chains from the ceiling, and the chimney-piece of sienna marble in my bedroom at Combray, in my grandparents' house. In those far distant days that, at the moment of waking, seemed present without being clear, but that I would see better in a little while, when I was fully awake. Then the memory of a fresh position would revive. The wall slid away in another direction. I was in my room in Madame de Saint-Deloup's house in the country. Good heavens, it must be 10 o'clock. They will have finished dinner. I must have overslept in the little nap that I always take when I come in from my walk with Madame de Saint-Loup before dressing for the evening. For many years have now elapsed since the Combray days, when coming in from the longest and latest walks, I would still be in time to see the red reflections of the sunset in the panes of my bedroom window. It is a very different existence at Tanzeville now with Madame de Saint-Loup, and a different kind of pleasure that I now derive from taking walks only in the evenings, from visiting by moonlight the roads on which I used to play as a child in the sunshine, and the bedroom in which I will presently fall asleep. Instead of dressing for dinner, from afar I can see it as we return from our walk, with its lamp shining through the window, a solitary beacon in the night. These shifting and confused gusts of memory never lasted for more than a few seconds. Often in my brief spell of uncertainty as to where I was, I did not distinguish the various suppositions of which that certainty was composed any more than when watching a horse run we isolate the successive positions of its body as they appear in the kineroscope. That I had seen first one and then another of the rooms in which I had dwelled during my life, and in the end I would revisit them all in the course of my waking dream. Bedrooms in winter, where on going to bed you at once bury your head in a nest, built up out of the most diverse materials, the corner of a pillow, the top of the blankets, a piece of shawl, the edge of your bed, and a copy of de Bat's Rose, all of which you contrive with the infinite patience of birds building their nests, to cement into one whole. Rooms where, in a keen frost, you feel the satisfaction of being shut in from the outer world, like the sea swallow that builds at the end of a dark tunnel and is kept warm by the surrounding earth, and where the fire kept burning all night in the fireplace you slept wrapped up in, as it were, in a great cloak of snug and savory air, shot through with the glow of the logs breaking out again in flame, in a sort of alcove without walls, a cave of warmth dug out of the heart of the room itself, a zone of heat whose boundaries were constantly shifting and altering in temperature as gusts of air ran across them to strike freshly on your face from the corners of the room, or from parts near the window, or from the fireplace that had therefore remained cold, or rooms in summer where you delight in feeling yourself a part of the warm evening, where the moonlight striking on the half-open shutter throws down to the foot of the bed its enchanted ladder, where you sleep almost in the open air, like a titmouse rocked by the breeze on the tip of a sunbeam, or sometimes the Louis XVI room, so cheerful that I could never feel really unhappy, even on my first night in it, that room where the slender columns that lightly support its ceilings would part, ever so gracefully, to indicate where the bed was, and to keep it separate. Sometimes again that little room with the high ceiling, hollowed in the form of a pyramid out of two separate stories, and partly walled with mahogany, in which from the first moment my mind was drugged by the unfamiliar scent of vetiver, convinced of the hostility of the violet curtains and of the insolent indifference of a clock that chattered on the top of its voice as though I were not there, while a strange and pitiless mirror with square feet, barring obliquely one corner of the room, cleared for itself a sight I had not expected to find inhabited in the quiet surroundings of my normal field of vision. That room in which my mind, forcing itself for hours on end to leave its moorings, to elongate itself upward so as to take on the exact shape of the room, and to reach the summit of that monstrous funnel, had passed so many anxious nights while my body lay stretched out in bed, my eyes staring upward, my ears straining, my nostrils sniffing uneasily, and my heart beating until habit had changed the color of the curtains and made the clock keep quiet, brought an expression of pity to the cruel slanting face of the mirror, disguised or even completely dispelled the scent of vetiver, and distinctly reduced the apparent loftiness of the ceiling. Habit, that skillful but unhurrying manager who begins by letting the mind suffer for weeks on end in a temporary abode, whom the mind, for all that, is fortunate in discovering, for without the help of habit it would be powerless by its own efforts to make any room seem habitable. Certainly I was now well awake. My body had turned about for the last time, and the good angel of certainty had made all the surrounding objects stand still, had set me down under my bedclothes in my bedroom, and had fixed approximately in their right places, in the uncertain light, my chest of drawers, my writing table, my fireplace, the window overlooking the street, and both the doors. But it was no good my knowing that I was not in any of those houses, of which, in the unknowing moment of waking, if I had not caught sight exactly, I could still believe in their possible presence, for memory was now set in motion. As a rule, I did not attempt to go to sleep again at once, but used to spend the greater part of the night recalling our life in the old days at Combray, with my great-aunt at Balbec, Paris, Doncières, Venice, and the rest, remembering again all the places and people I had known, what I had actually seen of them, and what had others told me. At Combray, as every afternoon ended long before the time when I would have gone up to bed and to lie there unsleeping, far from my mother and grandmother, my bedroom became the fixed point on which my melancholy and anxious thoughts were centered. Someone had the happy idea of giving me, to distract me on the evenings when I seemed unusually wretched, a magic lantern, which used to be set on top of my lamp while we waited for dinner time to come. In the manner of the master builders and glass painters of Gothic days, it substituted for the opaqueness of my rooms, of my walls, as impalpable iridescence, supernatural apparitions of many colors in which legends were depicted, as on a shifting and transitory window. But my sorrows were only increased, because this change of lighting destroyed, as nothing else could have done, the customary impression I had formed of my room, thanks to which the room itself, but for the torture of having to go to bed in it, had become quite endurable. For now I no longer recognized it, and I became uneasy as though I were in a room in some hotel or chalet, in a place where I had just arrived by train for the first time. Riding at a jerky trot, Golo, his mind filled with an infamous design, issued from the three little cornered forests which dyed dark green the slope of a hill, and advanced by leaps and bounds through the castle of poor Geneviève de Bourbon. This castle was cut off short by a curved line that was, in fact, the circumference of one of the transparent ovals in the slides that were pushed into the position through a slot in the lantern. It was only the wing of a castle, and in front of it stretched a meadow on which Geneviève stood, lost in contemplation, wearing a blue sash. The castle and the meadow were yellow, but I could tell their color without waiting to see them, for before the slides made their appearance, the bronze sonority of the name Brabant had given me an unmistakable clue. Golo stopped for a moment and listened sadly to a little speech read aloud by my great-aunt, which he seemed perfectly to understand, for he modified his attitude with a docility not devoid of a degree of majesty so as to conform to the indications given in the text. Then he rode away at the same jerky trot, and nothing could arrest his slow progress. If the lantern were moved, I could still distinguish Golo's horse, advancing across the window curtains, swelling out with their curves and diving in their folds. The body of Golo himself, being of the same supernatural substance as his steed, overcame all material obstacles. Everything that seemed to bar his way, by taking each as it might be a skeleton and embodying it in himself, the door-handle, for instance, over which, adapting itself at once, would float invincibly his red cloak or his pale face, never losing its nobility or its melancholy, never showing any sign of trouble at such a transvertebration. And indeed, I found plenty of charm in these bright projections, which seemed to have come straight out of a Merovingian past, and to shed around me the reflections of such ancient history. But I cannot express the discomfort I felt at such an intrusion of mystery and beauty into a room which I had succeeded in filling with my own personality, until I thought no more of the room than of myself. The anesthetic effect of habit having ceased, I would begin to think and to feel, which are such melancholy occupations. The door-handle of my room, which was different to me from all the other door-handles in the world, inasmuch as it seemed to open of its own accord and without my having to turn it, so unconscious had its manipulation become, lo and behold, it was now an astral body for Golo. And as soon as the dinner bell rang, I would run down to the dining room, where the big hanging lamp, ignorant of Golo and Bluebeard, but well acquainted with my family and the dish of stewed beef, shed the same light as on every other evening, and I would fall into the arms of my mother, whom the misfortunes of Genevieve de Brabant had made all the dearer to me, just as the crimes of Golo had driven me to a more ordinarily scrupulous examination of my own conscience. But after dinner, alas, I was obliged to leave Mamma, who stayed talking with the others in the garden, if the weather was fine, or in the little parlor where everyone took shelter when it rained, everyone except my grandmother, who held that it is a pity to shut oneself indoors in the country, and used to carry on endless discussions with my father on the days when it rained a lot, because he would send me up to my room with a book instead of letting me stay outdoors. "That is not the way to make him strong and active," she would say sadly, "especially this little man, who needs all the strength and resolve he can get." My father would shrug his shoulders and study the barometer, for he liked meteorology, while my mother, keeping very quiet so as not to disturb him, looked at him, with tender respect, but not too hard, not wishing to penetrate the mysteries of his superior mind. But my grandmother, in all weathers, even when the rain was coming down in torrents, and Françoise had rushed indoors with the precious wicker armchairs so they would not get soaked, you would see my grandmother pacing the deserted garden, lashed by the storm, pushing back her disheveled gray hair so that her brows might be more free to imbibe the life-giving gusts of wind and rain. She would say, "At last one can breathe," and would run up and down the soggy paths, too straight and symmetrical for her liking, owing to the want of any feeling for nature in the new gardener, whom my father had been asking all morning if the weather were going to improve. With her keen, jerky little step regulated by the various effects wrought on her soul by the intoxication of the storm, the force of hygiene, the stupidity of my education and of symmetry in gardens, rather than by any anxiety, for that was quite unknown to her, to save her plum-colored skirt from the spots of mud under which it would gradually disappear, to a height that always provided her maid with a problem and filled her with despair. When my grandmother's walks took place after dinner, there was one thing that never failed to bring her back to the house. That was if, at one of those points when the revolutions of a promenade brought her moth-like, in sight of the lamp, in the little parlor where the liquors were set out on the card table, my great-aunt called out to her, "Bathilde, come in and stop your husband from drinking brandy." for simply to tease her. She had brought so foreign a type of mind into my father's family that everyone teased and tormented her. My great-aunt used to make my grandfather, who was forbidden liqueurs, take just a few drops. My poor grandmother would come in and beg and implore her husband not to taste the brandy, and he would become annoyed and swallow his few drops all the same, and she would go out again sad and discouraged, but still smiling, for she was so humble and so sweet that her gentleness toward others and her continual subordination of herself and of her own troubles appeared on her face blended in a smile, which, unlike those seen on the majority of human faces, had no trace in it of irony, save for herself, while for all of us kisses seemed to spring from her eyes, which could not look on those she loved without yearning to bestow on them passionate caresses. The torments inflicted on her by my great-aunt, the sight of my grandmother's vain entreaties and of her weakness conquered before her, began, but still making the futile endeavor to wean my grandfather from his liquor glass. All these things were of the sort to which, in later years, one can grow so well accustomed as to smile at them, to take the tormentor's side with a happy determination that deludes one into the belief that it is not really tormenting. But in those days they filled me with such horror that I longed to strike my great-aunt. And yet, as soon as I heard her, "Bathilde, come in and stop your husband from drinking brandy," in my cowardice I became at once a man, and did what all we grown men do when face to face with suffering and injustice. I preferred not to see them. I ran up to the top of the house to cry by myself in a little room beside the schoolroom, and beneath the roof, which smelled of orris root, and was scented also by a wild currant bush that had climbed up between the stones of the outer wall and thrust a flowering branch in through the half-opened window. Intended for more special and baser use, this room, from which in the daytime I could see as far as the donjon of the Rue Saint-Ville-les-Pins, was for a long time my place of refuge, doubtless because it was the only room whose door I was allowed to lock. Whenever my occupation was such as required an inviolable solitude, reading or dreaming, secret tears or sensual pleasure, alas, I little knew that my own lack of willpower, my delicate health, and the consequent uncertainty as to my future weighed far more heavily on my grandmother's mind than any little breach of the dietary rules by her husband. During those endless perambulations, afternoon and evening, in which we used to see passing up and down, obliquely raised toward the heavens, her handsome face with its brown and wrinkled cheeks, which with age had acquired almost the purple hue of tilled fields in autumn, covered, if she was walking abroad, by a half-lifted veil, while on them either the stone, the cold, or some sad reflection invariably left the drying traces of an involuntary tear. My sole consolation when I went upstairs for the night was that Mamma would come and kiss me after I was in bed. But this good night lasted for so short a time, she went down again so soon, that the moment in which I heard her climb the stairs, and then caught the sound of her garden dress of blue muslin, from which little tassels of plaited straw rustling along the double-door corridor, was for me a moment of sorrow. It announced the moment that was to follow it, when she would have left me, when she would have gone down back stairs. So much did I love that good night, that I reached the stage of hoping it would come as late as possible, as to prolong the time of respite during which Mamma would not yet have appeared. Sometimes, when after kissing me she opened the door to go, I longed to call her back, to say to her, "Kiss me just once more." But I knew that then she would at once look displeased. For the concession that she made to my wretchedness and agitation in coming up to kiss me, in bringing me this kiss of peace, always annoyed my father, who thought such ceremonies absurd, and she would have liked to try to induce me to outgrow the need, the habit of having her there at all, which is a very different thing from letting me acquire the habit of asking her, when she was already crossing the threshold, for another kiss. and to see her look displeased destroyed all the sense of tranquillity she had brought me a moment before, when she bent her loving face down over my bed, and held it out to me like a host for an act of communion in which my lips might drink deeply the sense of her real presence, and with it the power to sleep. But those evenings on which Mamma stayed so short a time in my room were sweet indeed compared with those on which we had guests to dinner, and therefore she did not come at all. Our guests were usually limited to M. Swann, who, apart from a few passing strangers, was almost the only person who ever came to the house at Combray, sometimes to a neighborly dinner, but less frequently since his unfortunate marriage, as my family did not care to receive his wife, and sometimes after dinner, uninvited. On those evenings when, as we sat in front of the house beneath the large chestnut tree, around the iron table, we heard at the far end of the garden not the copious and shrill bell that drenched, that deafened with its ferruginous, interminable, and frozen noise, any member of the household who set it off by coming in without ringing, but the double tinkle, timid, oval, golden, of the visitor's bell. Everyone would at once exclaim, "A visitor! Who in the world can it be?" But they knew quite well that it could only be M. Swann. My great-aunt, speaking in a loud voice, to set an example in a tone that she endeavored to make sound natural, would tell the others not to whisper so, that nothing could be more unpleasant for someone coming in, who would be led to think that people were saying things about him that he was not meant to hear. And then my grandmother would be sent out as a scout, always happy to find an excuse for an additional turn in the garden, which she would utilize to remove surreptitiously as she passed the stakes of a rose tree or two, so as to make the roses look a little more natural, as a mother might run her hand through her boy's hair after the barber had smoothed it down too much, to make it puff out properly around his head. And there we would stay, hanging on the words that would fall from my grandmother's lips when she brought us back report of the enemy, as though there had been some uncertainty among a vast number of possible invaders. And then soon after my grandfather would say, "I can hear Swann's voice." And indeed, one could tell him only by his voice, for it was difficult to make out his face with its arched nose and green eyes under a high forehead, fringed with blonde, almost red hair, dressed in the Bresson style, because in the garden we used as little light as possible so as not to attract mosquitoes. And I would slip away as though not going for anything in particular, to tell them to bring out the syrups. My grandmother made a great point, thinking it nicer, of their not being allowed to seem anything out of ordinary, and for visitors only. Although a far younger man, M. Swann was very much attached to my grandfather, who had been a close friend of Swann's father, an excellent but eccentric man, in whom the least little thing would, it seemed, often check the flow of his spirits and divert the current of his thoughts. Several times in the course of a year I would hear my grandfather tell at the table the story, which never varied, of the behavior of M. Swann the elder on the death of his wife, by whose bedside he had watched day and night. My grandfather, who had not seen him for a long time, hastened to join him at the Swann's family property at the outskirts of Combray, and managed to entice him for a moment, weeping profusely, out of the room where she lay dead, so that he would not be present when the body was laid in its coffin. They took a turn or two in the park, where there was a little sunshine. Suddenly M. Swann seized my grandfather by the arm and cried, "Oh, my dear friend, how fortunate we are to be walking here together in such fine weather. Don't you see how pretty they are, all these trees, my hawthorns, and my new pond, on which you have never congratulated me? You look down in the dumps. Don't you feel this little breeze? Ah, whatever you may say, it is good to be alive all the same, my dear Amédée." And then, abruptly, the memory of his dead wife returned to him, and probably thinking it too complicated to inquire into how, at such a time, he could have allowed himself to be carried away by an impulse of happiness, he confined himself to a gesture that he habitually employed whenever any perplexing question came into his mind. That is, he passed his hand across his forehead, dried his eyes, and wiped his glasses. And he could never be consoled for the loss of his wife, but used to say to my grandfather during the 2 years by which he survived her, "It's a funny thing now. I very often think of my poor wife. but I cannot think of her very much at any one time. Often, but a little at a time, like poor old Swann, became one of my grandfather's favorite phrases, which he would apply to all kinds of things. And I would have assumed that this father of Swann's had been a monster if my grandfather, whom I regarded as a better judge than myself, and whose word was my law and often led me, in the long run, to pardon offences I would have been inclined to condemn, had not gone on to exclaim, but after all, he had a heart of gold. For many years, and before his marriage, when M. Swann the younger came often to see them at Combray, my great-aunt and grandparents never suspected that he had entirely ceased to live in the kind of society that his family had frequented, or that under the sort of incognito that the name Swann gave him among us, they were harboring, with the complete innocence of a family of honest innkeepers who had in their midst some distinguished bandit and never knew it, one of the most elegant members of the Jockey Club, a particular friend of the Comte de Paris, and of the Prince of Wales, and one of the men most sought after in the aristocratic world of the Faubourg Saint-Germain. Our utter ignorance of the brilliant part that Swann was playing in the world of high society was, of course, due in part to his own reserve and discretion, but also to the fact that the middle-class people in those days took what was almost a Hindu view of society, which they held to consist of sharply defined castes, so that everyone at his birth found himself called to that station in life that his parents already occupied, and nothing, except the chance of a brilliant career or a fortunate marriage, could extract them from that station or admit you to a superior caste. M. Swann, the father, had been a stockbroker, and so young Swann found himself immured for life in a caste where one's fortune, as in a list of taxpayers, varied between such and such limits of income. We knew the people with whom his father had associated, and so we knew his own associates, the people with whom he was in a position to mix. If he knew other people besides, those were youthful acquaintances on whom the old friends of the family, like my relatives, shut their eyes all the more good-naturedly, because Swann himself, after the death of his parents, still came most faithfully to see us. But we would have been eager to wager that the people outside our acquaintance whom Swann knew were of the sort to whom he would not have dared raise his hat had he met them while he was walking with us. Had there been such a thing as determination to apply to Swann a social coefficient peculiar to himself, distinct from all the other sons of stockbrokers in his father's position, his coefficient would have been rather lower than theirs, because leading a very simple life, and having always had a craze for antiques and pictures, he now lived and piled up his collections in an old mansion that my grandmother longed to visit, but that stood on the Quai d'Orléans, a neighborhood in which my great-aunt thought it was most degrading to live. "Are you really a connoisseur now?" she would say to him. "I ask for your own sake, as you are likely to have fakes palmed off on you by the dealers." For she did not, in fact, endow him with any critical faculty, and had no great opinion of the intelligence of the man who, in conversation, would avoid serious topics, and showed a very dull preciseness, not only when he gave us kitchen recipes, going into the most minute details, but even when my grandmother's sisters were talking to him about art. When challenged by them to give an opinion, or to express his admiration for some picture, he would remain almost impolitely silent, and would then make amends by furnishing, if he could, some fact or other about the museum in which the picture was hung, or the date at which it had been painted, but as a rule he would content himself with trying to amuse us by telling us the story of his latest adventure, and he would have a new story for us on every occasion, with someone whom we ourselves knew, such as the Combray pharmacist, or our cook, or our coachman. These stories certainly used to make my great-aunt laugh, but she could never tell whether that was on account of the absurd parts which Swann invariably made himself play in the adventures, or of the wit that he showed in telling us of them. "It is easy to see that you are a real character, M. Swann." As she was the only member of our family who could be described as a trifle common, she would always take care to remark to strangers when Swann was mentioned that he could easily, if he had wished to, have lived in the Boulevard Haussmann or the Avenue de l'Opera, that he was the son of old M. Swann, who must have left him 4 or 5 million francs, but that it was a whim of his, a whim which, moreover, she thought was bound to amuse other people so much that in Paris, when M. Swann called on New Year's Day, bringing her little packet of marron glace, she never failed, if there were guests in the room, to say to him, "Well, M. Swann, and do you still live next door to the wine depot, so as to be sure of not missing your train when you go to Lyon?" And she would peep out of the corner of her eye over her lorgnon at the other visitors. But if anyone had suggested to my aunt that this Swann, who in his capacity as the son of old M. Swann, was fully qualified to be received by any of the upper middle class, the most respected notaries and lawyers of Paris, though he was perhaps a trifle inclined to let this hereditary privilege go into abeyance, had another almost secret existence of a wholly different kind, that when he left our house in Paris, saying that he must go to bed, he would no sooner have turned the corner than he would stop, retrace his steps, and be off to some drawing-room, on whose like no stockbroker or associate of stockbrokers had ever set eyes, that would have seemed to my aunt as extraordinary as to a woman of wider reading, the thought of being herself on terms of intimacy. With Aristeus, of knowing that he would, when he had finished his conversation with her, plunge deep into the realms of Thetis, into an empire veiled from mortal eyes, in which Virgil depicts him as being received with open arms, or to be content with an image more likely to have occurred to her, for she had seen it painted on the paints we used for petit fours at Combray, of having had to dinner Ali Baba, who, as soon as he found himself alone and unobserved, would make his way into the cave, resplendent with its unsuspected treasures. One day, when he had come to see us after dinner in Paris, and had apologized for being in evening clothes, Françoise, when he had gone, told us that she had gotten it from his coachman that they had been dining with a princess. "A princess of the demi-monde, no doubt," said my aunt, and she shrugged her shoulders without raising her eyes from her knitting, serenely ironical. Although my aunt used to treat him with scant ceremony, since she was of the opinion that he ought to be flattered by our invitation, she thought it only natural that he would never come to see us in summer without a basket of peaches or raspberries from his garden, and from that each of his visits to Italy he would bring us some photographs of masterpieces. It seemed quite natural, therefore, to send to him whenever we wanted a recipe for gribiche sauce or for a pineapple salad for one of our big dinner parties, to which he himself would not be invited, not seeming of sufficient importance to be served up to new friends who might be in our house for the first time. If the conversation turned to the princes of the House of France, people you and I would never know, we will and don't want to, do we? My great-aunt would say to Swann, who had perhaps a letter from Twickenham in his pocket. She would make him move the piano and turn over music on evenings when my grandmother's sister sang, manipulating this creature so rare and refined at other times and in other places, with the rough simplicity of a child who will play with some curio from the cabinet no more carefully than if it were a cheap toy. Certainly the Swann who was a familiar figure in all the clubs of those days differed greatly from the Swann created in my great-aunt's mind, when of an evening in our little garden at Combray, after the 2 shy peals had sounded from the little bells, she would vitalize, by injecting into it everything she had ever heard about the Swann family, the vague and unrecognizable shape that began to appear, with my grandmother in its wake against a background of shadows, and could at last be identified by the sound of his voice. But then, even in the most insignificant details of our daily life, none of us can be said to constitute a material whole which is identical for everyone, and need only be consulted like a page in an account book or the record of a will. Our social personality is a creation of the minds of others. Even the simple act that we describe as seeing someone we know is to some extent an intellectual process. We pack the physical outline of the creature we see with all the ideas we have already formed about him, and in the complete picture of him that we compose in our minds, those ideas have certainly the principal place. In the end, they come to fill out so completely the curve of his cheeks, so follow so exactly the line of his nose, they blend so harmoniously in the sound of his voice, that these seem to be no more than a transparent envelope, so that each time we see the face or hear the voice, it is our own ideas of him which we recognize, and to which we listen. And so, no doubt, from the Swann they had built up for their own purposes, my family had left out in their ignorance a whole crowd of the details of his daily social life, details by means of which other people, when they met him, saw all the graces enthroned in his face, and stopping at the line of his arched nose as a natural frontier, but they contrived also to put into a face from which its distinction had been evicted, a face vacant and roomy as an uninhabited house, to plant in the depths of its unvalued eyes a lingering sense, uncertain but not unpleasing, half memory and half oblivion, of idle hours spent together after our weekly dinners, around the card table or in the garden during our neighborly country life. Our friends bodily that their own special Swann had become to my people a complete and living creature, so that even now I have the feeling of leaving someone I know for another quite different person. When going back in memory, I pass from the Swann whom I knew later, and more intimately, to this early Swann in whom I can distinguish the charming mistakes of my childhood, and who, incidentally, is less like his successor than he is like the other people I knew at that time. As though one's life were a museum in which all the portraits of any one period have a marked family likeness, the same tonality, this early Swann abounding in leisure, fragrant with the scent of the great chestnut tree, of baskets of raspberries, and of a sprig of tarragon. And yet one day, when my grandmother had gone to ask some favor of a lady whom she had known at the Sacré-Cœur, and with whom, because of our caste system, she had not cared to keep up any degree of intimacy in spite of a mutual feeling of friendship, the Marquis de Villeparisis, of the famous house of Bouillon, this lady had said to her, "I think you know M. Swann very well. He is a great friend of my nephew's, the Delon." My grandmother had returned from the call full of enthusiasm for the house, which overlooked some gardens, and which Madame de Villeparisis had advised her to rent an apartment, and also for a waistcoat tailor and his daughter, who kept a little shop in the courtyard, into which she had gone to ask them to put a stitch in her skirt, which she had torn on the staircase. My grandmother had found these people perfectly charming. The girl, she said, was a jewel, the tailor a most distinguished man, the finest she had ever seen, for in her eyes distinction was a thing wholly independent of social position. She was in ecstasies over some answer the tailor had made, saying to Mamma Savigny, would not have said it better. And by way of contrast, of a nephew of Madame Villeparisis, whom she had met at the house, "My dear, he is so common." Now, the effect of that remark that's about Swann had been not to raise him in my great-aunt's estimation, but to lower Madame Villeparisis. It appeared that the deference which, on my grandmother's authority, we owed to the Madame de Parisis imposed on her the reciprocal obligation to do nothing that would render her less worthy of our regard, and that she had failed in her duty by becoming aware of Swann's existence and by allowing members of her family to associate with him. How would she know Swann? A lady who, you always made out, was related to Marshal MacMahon. This view of Swann's social atmosphere which prevailed in my family seemed to be confirmed later on by his marriage to a woman of the worst class. You might also say a prostitute, whom, to do him justice, he never attempted to introduce to us, continuing to come to us alone, though more and more seldom, but from whom they thought they could establish, supposing that he had found her there, the milieu unknown to them that he frequented. But on one occasion my grandfather read in a newspaper that M. Swann was one of the most faithful attendants at the Sunday luncheons given by the Duc d'Aix, who, father and uncle, had been among our most prominent statesmen in the reign of Louis Philippe. Now my grandfather was curious to learn all the little details that might help him to imagine the private lives of men like Molay, the Duc Pasquier, or le Duc de Broglie. He was delighted to find that Swann associated with people who had known them. My great-aunt, however, interpreted this piece of news in a sense unfavorable to Swann, for anyone who chose his associates outside the caste in which he had been born and bred, outside his own social class, was condemned to utter degradation in her eyes. It seemed to her that such a person abdicated all claim to enjoy the fruits of those friendly relations with people of good position that prudent parents cultivate and store up for their children's benefit. For my great-aunt had actually ceased to see the son of a lawyer we had known because he had married a highness, and therefore stepped down in her eyes from the respectable position of a lawyer's son to that of those adventurers, upstart footmen, or stable boys to whom we read that queens have sometimes shown their favours. She objected, therefore, to my grandfather's plan of questioning Swann when he came to dine with us about these people whose friendship with him we had discovered. On the other hand, my grandmother's two sisters, elderly spinsters, who shared her nobility of character but lacked her intelligence, declared that they could not conceive what pleasure their brother-in-law could find in talking about such trifles. They were women of lofty ambition who, for that reason, were incapable of taking the least interest in what might be called gossip, even when it had a historical value, and generally speaking in anything that was not directly associated with some aesthetic or edifying object. So complete was their negation of interest in anything that seemed directly or indirectly a part of our everyday life, that their sense of hearing, which had gradually come to understand its own futility when the tone of the conversation at the dinner table became frivolously or meanly mundane, without the two ladies being able to guide it back to topics dear to themselves, would leave its receptive channels unemployed so effectively that they were actually becoming atrophied. So that if my grandfather wished to attract the attention of the two sisters, he would have to make use of some alarm signals as alienists adopt in dealing with their distracted patients, beating several times on a glass with the blade of a knife, fixing them at the same time with a sharp word and a compelling glance, violent methods that the said doctors are apt to bring with them into their everyday life among the sane, either from the force of professional habit or because they think the whole world a trifle mad. Their interest grew, however, when, the day before Swann was to dine with us, and when he had sent to them as a special present a case of Asti wine, my aunt, holding a copy of the Figaro, in which, next to the name of a painting then on a view in the Corot exhibition, were added the words from the collection of M. Charles Swann, asked, "Did you see that Swann is mentioned on the front page of the Figaro?" "But I have always told you," said my grandmother, "that he had plenty of taste." "You would, of course," retorted my great-aunt, "say anything just to seem different from us." For knowing that my grandmother never agreed with her, and not being quite confident that it was her opinion that the rest of us invariably endorsed, she wished to extort from us a wholesale condemnation of my grandmother's views, against which she hoped to force us into solidarity within her own. But we sat silent. My grandmother's sisters have expressed a desire to mention to Swann this reference to him in the Figaro. My great-aunt dissuaded them. Whenever she saw in others an advantage, however trivial, which she herself lacked, she would persuade herself that it was no advantage at all, but a drawback, and would pity so as not to have to envy at them. "I don't think that would please him at all. I know very well I would hate to see my name printed like that, as large as life, in the paper, and I wouldn't feel at all flattered if anyone spoke to me about it." She did not, however, persist in trying to persuade my grandmother's sisters, for they, in their horror of vulgarity, had brought to such a fine art the concealment of a personal allusion in a wealth of ingenious circumlocution that it would often pass unnoticed even by the person to whom it was addressed. As for my mother, her only thought was of managing to induce my father to consent to speak to Swann, not of his wife, but of his daughter, whom he had worshipped, and for whose sake it was understood that he ultimately made his unfortunate marriage. "You need only say a word. Just ask him how she is. It must be so very hard for him." My father, however, was annoyed. No, you have the most absurd ideas. It would be utterly ridiculous." But the only one of us in whom the prospect of Swann's arrival gave rise to an unhappy foreboding was myself. And And that was because on the evenings when there were visitors, or just Swann in the house, Mama did not come up to my room. But on those evenings I used to dine earlier than the others, and to come in afterward and sit at the table until 8 o'clock, when it was understood that I must go upstairs. That frail and precious kiss that Mamma usually gave me when I was in bed, and just going to sleep, I had to take with me from the dining room to my bedroom, and to keep in violet all the time it took me to undress, without letting its sweet charm be broken, without letting its volatile essence diffuse itself and evaporate. And just on those very evenings when I needed to receive it with more precaution, I had to snatch it, to seize it instantly, publicly, without even having the time or being properly free to apply to what I was doing the concentration that maniacs use to compel themselves to exclude all other thoughts from their minds while they are shutting a door, so that when the sickness of uncertainty sweeps over them again, they can triumphantly face and overcome it with the recollection of the precise moment in which the door was shut. We were all in the garden when the double peal of the gale-bait sounded. Everyone knew it must be Swann. And yet, they looked at one another inquiringly and sent my grandmother scouting. "See that you thank him intelligibly for the wine," my grandfather urged his two sisters-in-law. "You know how delicious it is, and it is a huge case." "Now don't start whispering," said my great-aunt. "How would you like to come into a house and find everyone muttering to themselves?" "Ah, there's Swann," said my father. "Let's ask him if he thinks it will be fine tomorrow." My mother believed that a word from her would wipe out all the unpleasantness that my family had caused Swann to feel since his marriage. She found an opportunity to draw him aside for a moment, but I followed her. I could not bring myself to let her go even a step away from me, knowing that in a few minutes I would have to leave her in the dining room and go up to my bed without the consoling thought, as on ordinary evenings, that she would come up later to kiss me. "Now, Swann," she said, "tell me about your daughter. I am sure she shows a taste already for fine things like her papa." "Come along and sit down here with us all on the veranda," said grandfather, coming up to him. My mother had to abandon the quest, but managed to extract from the restriction itself a further refinement of thought, as good poets do when the tyranny of rhyme forces them into the discovery of their finest lines. "We can talk about her again when we are by ourselves," she whispered to Swann. "Only a mother can understand. I am sure that hers would agree with me." And so we all sat down round the iron table, and I would have liked not to think of the hours of anguish that I would have to spend that evening, alone in my room, without the possibility of going to sleep. I tried to convince myself that they were of no importance really, since I would have forgotten them next morning, and to fix my mind on thoughts of the future, which would carry me as on a bridge across terrifying abyss that yawned at my feet. But my mind, strained by this foreboding, distended like the look that I shot at my mother, would not allow any other impression to enter. Thoughts did indeed enter it, but only on the condition that they left behind them every element of beauty, or every of jesting by which I might have distracted or beguiled. As a surgical patient, by means of a local anesthetic, can look upon a clear consciousness while an operation is being performed on him and yet feel nothing, I could repeat to myself some favorite lines, or watch my grandfather attempting to talk to Swann about the Duc d'Urfeuil-Basquiat without being able to kindle any emotion from one or amusement from the other. All my efforts failed to distract me. Hardly had my grandfather begun to question Swann about the orator when one of my grandmother's sisters, in whose ears the question echoed like a solemn but untimely silence that it was not impolite to break, addressed the other with, "Just fancy, Celine, I met a young Swedish governess today who told me some most interesting things about the cooperative movement in Scandinavia. We really must have her to dine here one evening." "To be sure," replied her sister Flora, "but I haven't wasted my time either. I met such a clever old man at M. Vitoul's who knows Mauban quite well, and Mauban has told him every last detail about how he prepares for a role. It is the most interesting thing I've ever heard. He is a neighbor of M. Venture's, and I never knew. And he is very nice. M. Venture is not the only one who has nice neighbors, cried my Aunt Celine in a voice that seemed loud because she was so timid, and seemed forced because she had been planning the little speech for so long, darting as she spoke what she called a significant glance at Swann. And my Aunt Flora, who realized that this utterance was Celine's way of thanking Swann for the Asti, looked at him with a blend of congratulation and irony, either simply because she wished to underline her sister's little flash of wit, or because she envied Swann his having inspired it, or merely because she imagined that he was embarrassed and could not help having a little fun at his expense. "I think it would be worthwhile," Flora went on, "to have this old gentleman to dinner. Would you get him on Maubant or Madame Materna? He will talk for hours on end." "That must be delightful," sighed my grandfather, in whose mind had unfortunately forgotten to include any capacity whatsoever for becoming passionately interested in the Swedish cooperative movement among the ladies of Sweden, or in the methods employed by Maubant to prepare for the roles, just as it had forgotten to endow my grandmother's two sisters with the little grain of salt that one has to add oneself in order to extract any savour from a narrative of the private life of Molé or of Comte de Paris. "I say," exclaimed Swann to my grandfather, "what I was going to tell you has more to do than you might think with what you are asking me just now. For in some respects there has been very little change. I came across a passage in Saint-Simon this morning that would have amused you. It is in the volume that covers his mission to Spain. Not one of the best, little more, in fact, than a journal, but at least it is a journal wonderfully well written, which plainly distinguishes it from the boring newspapers that we feel bound to read day and night." "I do not agree with you. There are some days when I find reading the newspapers very pleasant indeed," my Aunt Flora broke in, to show Swann that she read the note about his Corot in the Figaro. "Yes, Aunt Celine, when her one better. When they write about things or people in whom we are interested." "I don't deny it," answered Swann in some bewilderment. "The fault I find with our newspapers is that they force us to take an interest in some fresh triviality or other every day, whereas only 3 or 4 books in a lifetime give us anything that is of real importance. Suppose that every morning, when we tore the wrapper off our paper with fevered hands, a transmutation were to take place, and we were to find inside it, shall we say, Pascal's Pensées?" He articulated the title with an ironic emphasis so as not to appear pedantic. "And then, in the gilt and tooled volumes that we open once in 10 years, he went on, showing that contempt for things of this world that some men of the world like to affect, we could read that the Queen of Greece had arrived at Cannes, or that the Princess de Leon had given a fancy dress ball. In that way we would arrive at the right proportion between information and publicity." But at once, regretting that he had allowed himself to speak, even in jest, of serious matters, he added ironically, "We are having a most entertaining conversation. I cannot think why we climb to these lofty summits." And then turning to my grandfather, "Well, Saint Simon tells us how Maulevrier had the audacity to offer his hand to his sons. You remember how he says of Maulevrier, 'Never did I find in that coarse bottle anything but ill humour, boorishness, and folly.'" "Coarse or not, I know bottles in which there is something very different," said Flora briskly, feeling bound to thank Swann as her sister, since the present of Asti had been addressed to them both. Celine began to laugh. Swann was puzzled, but went on, "I cannot say whether it was his ignorance or a trap," writes Saint-Simon. "He wished to give his hand to my children. I noticed it in time to prevent him." My grandfather was already in ecstasies over ignorance or a trap, but Mademoiselle Celine, in whom the name of Saint-Simon, a man of letters, had prevented the complete paralysis of her sense of hearing, was already growing indignant. "What? You admire that, do you? Well, it's disgraceful. But what is the point of it? Does he mean that one man isn't as good as another? What difference can it make whether he is a duke or a groom as long as he is intelligent and good? He had a very fine way of bringing up his children, your Saint Simon. If he hadn't taught them to shake hands with all honest men, really and truly, it's abominable. And you dare to quote it. And my grandfather, utterly depressed, realizing how futile it would be for him against this opposition to attempt to get Swann to tell him the stories that would have amused him, murmured to my mother, "Just tell me again that line you taught me that always comforts me so much on these occasions." "Oh, yes. What virtues, Lord? Thou makest us abhor." Ah, how good that is. I never took my eyes off my mother. I knew that when we were at table I would not be permitted to stay there for the whole of the dinner time, and that Mamma, for fear of annoying my father, would not allow me to kiss her several times in front of the guests as she would have in my room. And so I promised myself in the dining room, as they began to eat and drink, and as I felt the hour approach, that I would put beforehand into this kiss, which was bound to be so brief and stealthy in execution, everything that my own efforts could put into it, would look carefully to choose the exact spot on her cheek that I would kiss, and would so prepare my thoughts that I might be able, thanks to the kiss, begun in my mind, to consecrate the whole of the minute Mamma would allow me to feel her cheek against my lips. As a painter who can have his subject for short sittings only prepares his palette, and from what he remembers and from his notes does in advance everything that he can possibly do in the sitter's absence. But tonight, before the dinner bell had sounded, my grandfather said with unconscious cruelty, "The little man looks tired. He'd better go up to bed. Besides, we are dining late tonight." And my father, who was less scrupulous than my grandmother or mother in observing the letter of a treaty, went on, "Yes, run along to bed." I would have kissed Mamma then and there, but at that moment the dinner bell rang. No, come on, leave your mother alone. You've said good night quite enough. These exhibitions are absurd. Go upstairs." And so I must set forthwith, without viaticum, must climb each step of the staircase against my heart, as the saying is, climbing in opposition to my heart's desire, which was to return to my mother, since she had not, by her kiss, given my heart leave to accompany me forth. That hateful staircase, up which I always passed with such dismay, gave out a smell of varnish which had to some extent absorbed and fixed the special quality of sorrow that I felt each evening, and made it perhaps even more cruel to my sensibility. Because it assumed this olfactory guise, my intellect was powerless to resist it. When we have gone to sleep with the maddening toothache, and are conscious only of it as a little girl whom we attempt, time after time, to pull out of the water, or as a line of Molière that we repeat incessantly to ourselves, it is a great relief to wake up so that our intelligence can disentangle the idea of a toothache from any artificial semblance of heroism or rhythmic cadence. It was the opposite of this relief that I felt when my anguish at having to go up to my bedroom entered my consciousness in a manner infinitely more rapid, instantaneous almost, a manner at once insidious and brusque, as I breathed in. Once in my room, I had to block up every exit, to close the shutters, to dig my own grave, as I turned down the bedclothes, to wrap myself in the shroud of my nightshirt. But before burying myself in the iron bed that had been placed there because on summer nights I was too hot among the rep curtains of the four-poster, I was stirred to revolt, and attempted the desperate stratagem of a condemned prisoner. I wrote to my mother begging her to come upstairs for an important reason that I could not tell her in my letter. My fear was that Françoise, my aunt's cook, who used to be put in charge of me when I was at Combray, might refuse to take my note. I had a suspicion that in her eyes, to carry a message to my mother when she had a guest would appear as inconceivable as it would be for the doorkeeper of a theatre to hand a letter to an actor on the stage. For things that might or might not be done, she possessed a code at once imperious, abundant, subtle, and uncompromising on points themselves imperceptible or irrelevant, which gave it a resemblance to those ancient laws that combined such cruel ordinances as the massacre of infants at the breast, with prohibitions of exaggerated refinement against seething the kid in his mother's milk, or eating of the sinew which is upon the hollow of the thigh. This code, if one could judge it by the sudden obstinacy that she would put into her refusal to carry out certain of our instructions, seemed to have foreseen such social complications and refinements of fashion as nothing in Françoise's surroundings or in her career as a servant in a village household could have put into her head. And we were obliged to assume that there were latent in her some past existence in the ancient history of France, noble and little understood, just as there is in those manufacturing towns where old mansions still testify to their former courtly days, and chemical workers toil among delicately sculptured scenes of the miracle of Theophilus or the Quatre Filles Aymon. In this particular instance, the article of her code that made it highly improbable that, barring an outbreak of fire, Françoise would go down and disturb Mamma when M. Swann was there for so unimportant a person as myself, was one embodying the respect she showed not only for the family, as for the dead, for the clergy, or for the royalty, but also for the stranger to whom one offers hospitality. A respect that I would perhaps have found touching in a book, but never failed to irritate me on her lips, because of the solemn and gentle tones in which she would utter it. And that irritated me more than usual this evening, when the sacred character in which she invested the dinner party might have had the effect of making her decline to disturb its ceremony. But to give myself one chance of success, I lied without hesitation, telling her that it was not in the least myself who wanted to write to Mamma, but Mamma who, on saying good night to me, had begged me not to forget to send her an answer about something she had asked me to find, and that she would certainly be very angry if this note were not taken to her. I think that Françoise did not believe me, for, like those primitive men whose senses were so much keener than our own, she could immediately detect by signs imperceptible to the rest of us the truth or falsehood of anything that we might wish to conceal from her. She studied the envelope for 5 minutes, as though an examination of the paper itself and the look of my handwriting could enlighten her as to the nature of the contents, or to tell her which article of her code she ought to refer the matter. Then she went out with an air of resignation that seemed to imply what a dreadful thing for parents to have a child like this. A moment later she returned to say that they were still having their ice cream and that it was impossible for the butler to deliver the letter at once, in front of everyone, but that when the finger bowls were put around he would find a way of slipping it into Mamma's hand. At once my anxiety subsided. It was now no longer, as it had been a moment ago, until tomorrow that I had lost my mother, for my little note was going, while annoying her, no doubt, and doubly so because this contrivance would make me ridiculous in Swann's eyes. All the same, to admit me, invisibly and enchanted, into the same room as herself, was going to whisper from me into her ear, for that forbidden and unfriendly dining room, where but a moment ago the ice cream itself, the granité, and the finger bowls seemed to me to be concealing pleasures that were mischievous and of a mortal sadness, because Mamma was tasting of them far from me, had opened its doors to me, and like a ripe fruit that burst through its skin, was going to pour out into my intoxicated heart Mamma's attention while she was reading what I had written. Now I was no longer separated from her. The barriers had fallen. An exquisite thread was binding us. Besides, that was not all, for surely Mamma would come. As for the agony through which I had just passed, I imagine that Swann would have laughed heartily at it if he had read my letter and had guessed its purpose, whereas on the contrary, as I was to learn in due course, a similar anguish had been the bane of his life for many years, and no one perhaps could have understood my feelings at that time so well as himself. To him, that anguish which lies in knowing that the creature one adores is in some place of enjoyment where oneself is not and cannot follow. To him, that anguish came through love, to which it is, in a sense, predestined, by which it must be equipped and adapted. But when, as had befallen me, such an anguish possesses one's soul before love has yet entered into one's life, then it must drift, awaiting love's coming, vague and free, without precise attachment, at the disposal of one sentiment today, of another tomorrow, of filial piety or affection for a comrade, and the joy with which I began my first apprenticeship when Françoise returned to tell me that my letter would be delivered. Swann, too, had known well that false joy which a friend can give us, or some relative of the woman we love, when on his arrival at the house or theatre where she is to be found for some ball or party or premiere at which he is to meet her, he sees us wandering outside, desperately awaiting some opportunity of communicating with her. He recognizes us, greets us familiarly, asks us what we're doing there, and when we invent a story of having some urgent message to give his relative or friend, he assures us that nothing could be simpler, takes us in at the door, and promises to send her down to us in 5 minutes. How much we love him, as at that moment I love Françoise, the good-natured intermediary who by a single word has made bearable, human, almost propitious, the inconceivable infernal scene of gaiety, in the thick of which we had been imagining swarms of enemies, perverse and seductive, beguiling away from us, even making laugh at us, the woman whom we love. If we are to judge of them by him, this relative who has accosted us, and who is himself an initiate in those cruel mysteries, then the other guests cannot be so demoniacal. Those inaccessible and torturing hours, into which she had gone to taste of unknown pleasures, behold an unhoped-for breach in the wall, and we are through it. Behold, one of the moments whose series will go to make up their sum, a moment as genuine as the rest, if not actually more important to us, because our mistress is more intensely a part of it. We picture it to ourselves, we possess it, we intervene in it. We have almost created it, the moment in which he goes to tell her that we are waiting there below. And very probably the other moments of the party will not be essentially different, will contain nothing else so exquisite or so able to make us suffer, since this kind friend has assured us that of course she will be delighted to come down. It will be far more amusing for her to talk to you than to be bored up there. Alas, Swann had learned by experience that the good intentions of a third party are powerless to control a woman who is annoyed to find herself pursued, even in a ballroom, by a man whom she does not love. Often the friend comes down again, alone. My mother did not appear, but with no attempt to safeguard my self-respect, which depended on her keeping up the fiction that she had asked me to let her know the result of my search for something or other, made Françoise tell me these words. There is no answer. Words I have so often since then heard the concierges in grand hotels and the footmen in gambling clubs repeat to some poor girl who appears in bewilderment. What? He said nothing? It's not possible. You did give him my letter, didn't you? Very well. I will wait a little longer. And just as she invariably protests that she does not need the extra gas burner that the concierge offers to light for her, and remains there, hearing nothing further except an occasional remark on the weather, that the porter exchanges with a bellhop, whom he will send off suddenly, when he notices the time to put some customer's drink on ice. So, having declined Françoise's offer to make me some tea or to stay beside me, I let her go off again to the servants' hall and lay down and shut my eyes and tried not to hear the voices of my family, who were drinking their coffee in the garden. But after a few moments, I realized that by writing that note to Mama, by approaching at the risk of making her angry so near to her that I felt I could reach out and grasp the moment in which I would see her again, I had cut myself off from the possibility of going to sleep until I had actually seen her. And my heart began to beat more and more painfully as I increased my agitation by ordering myself to keep calm and to acquiesce in my ill fortune. Then, suddenly, my anxiety subsided. A feeling of intense happiness coursed through me, as when a strong medicine begins to take effect and one's pain vanishes. I had formed a resolution to abandon all attempts to go to sleep without seeing Mama, and had decided to kiss her at all costs, even with the certainty of being in disgrace with her for long afterward. When she herself came to bed, the tranquility that followed my anguish made me extremely happy, no less than my sense of expectation, my thirst for and my fear of danger. Noiselessly, I opened the window and sat down on the foot of the bed, hardly daring to move in case they should hear from me from below. Outside, things seemed also fixed in mute attention, so as not to disturb the moonlight, which, duplicating each of them and throwing each one back by extension forward of its shadow, denser and more concrete than itself, had made the whole landscape seem at once thinner and longer, like a map which, after being folded up, is spread out. What had to move, a leaf of the chestnut tree, for instance, moved, but its minute shuddering complete, finished to the last detail, and with utmost delicacy made no discord with the rest of the scene, and yet was not merged in it, remained clearly outlined. Exposed on this surface of silence, which absorbed nothing from them, the most distant sounds, those that must have come from places, from gardens at the far end of town, could be distinguished with such exact finish that the impression they gave of coming from a distance seemed only to their pianissimo execution, like those movements on muted strings so well performed by the orchestra of the Conservatoire. That, although one does not lose a single note, one thinks all the same that they are being played somewhere outside, far from the concert hall, so that all the old subscribers and my grandmother's sisters too, when Swann had given them his seats, used to strain their ears as if they had caught the distant approach of an army on the march, which had not yet rounded the corner of the Rue de Trevis. I knew that of all the positions in which I might place myself, this one could have, for me, the gravest consequences at my parents' hands, consequences far graver indeed than a stranger would have imagined, and such as he would have thought could follow only some really shameful fault. But in the system of education that they had given me, faults were not classified in the same order as in that of other children, and I had been taught to place at the head of the list, doubtless because there were no other class of faults from which I needed to be more carefully protected, those in which I can now distinguish the common feature that one succumbs to by yielding to a nervous impulse. But such words as these last had never uttered in my hearing. No one had yet named this reason for my faults, which might have led me to believe that there was some excuse for my giving in to them, or that I could actually, or was actually, incapable of holding out against them. Yet, I could easily recognize this class of transgressions by the anguish that preceded, as well as by the rigor of the punishment that followed them. And I knew that the transgression that I had just committed was in the same category as others for which I had been severely punished, though infinitely more serious. When I went out to meet my mother as she herself was coming up to bed, and when she saw that I had remained up to say good night to her again in the corridor, I would not be allowed to stay in the house a day longer. I would be packed off to boarding school the next morning. So much was certain. Very well. Had I been obliged 5 minutes later to hurl myself out of the window, I would still have preferred such a fate. For what I wanted now was Mama, and to say good night to her, and I had gone too far along the road that led to realization of this desire to be able to turn back. I could hear my parents' footsteps as they accompanied Swann to the gate, and when the tinkling of the bell assured me that he had just left, I went to the window. Mamma was asking my father if he had thought the lobster good, and whether Swann had had some of the coffee and pistachio ice cream. I thought it rather so-so, my mother said. Next time we will have to try another flavor. I can't tell you, said my great-aunt, what a change I find in Swann. He has aged so much. She'd grown so accustomed to seeing Swann always in the same stage of adolescence that she was shocked to find him suddenly less young than the age she still attributed to him. And my parents, too, were beginning to remark in him that abnormal, scandalous senescence, fitting for celibates, for all those for whom it seems that the great day that knows no tomorrow must be longer than for other men, since for them it is void of promise, and from its dawn the moments steadily accumulate without any subsequent partition among their offspring. I think he has a lot of trouble with that trollop he married, who lives with a certain Monsieur de Charlus, as all Combray knows. It's the talk of the town. My mother observed that in spite of this, he had looked much less unhappy of late. And he doesn't nearly so often do that trick of his, so like his father, of wiping his eyes and passing his hand across his forehead. I think myself that in his heart of hearts, he doesn't love his wife any more. Why, of course he doesn't, answered my grandfather. He wrote me a letter about it ages ago, to which I took care to pay no attention, but it left no doubt as to his feelings, at least about his love for his wife. Ah, you two, you never thanked him for the asti, he went on, turning to his sisters-in-law. What? We never thanked him? I think between you and me that we put it quite neatly, replied my Aunt Flora. Yes, you managed it very well. I admired you for it, said my Aunt Celine. But you did it very prettily, too. Yes, I liked my expression about nice neighbors. What? Do you call that thanking him? Shouted my grandfather. I heard that all right, but devil take me if I guessed it was meant for Swann. You may be quite sure he never noticed it. Come, Swann is not a fool. I am positive he appreciated the compliment. You didn't expect me to tell him the number of bottles or to guess what he paid for them. My mother and father were left alone and sat down for a moment. Then my father said, Well, shall we go up to bed? As you wish, dear, though I don't feel in the least like sleeping. It can't be the coffee ice cream. It wasn't strong enough to keep me awake like this. But I see a light in the servants' hall. Poor Françoise has been sitting up for me, so I will get her to unhook me while you go and undress. My mother opened the lattice door that led from the hall to the staircase. Soon I heard her coming upstairs to close her window. I went quietly into the hall. My heart was beating so violently I could hardly move, but at least it was throbbing no longer with anxiety, but with terror, with joy. I saw on the well of the stairs a light coming upward from Mamma's candle. Then I saw Mamma herself. I threw myself on her. For an instant she looked at me in astonishment, not realizing what had happened. Then her face assumed an expression of anger. She said not a single word to me, and for that matter, I used to go on for several days without being spoken to for far less than this. A single word from Mamma would have been an admission that further intercourse with me was within the bounds of possibility, and that might perhaps have appeared to me more terrible still, as indicating that with such a punishment as was in store for me, mere silence and even anger were relatively puerile. A word from her then would have been like the calm in which one converses with a servant to whom one has decided to give notice, the kiss one bestows on a son who is being packed off to enlist, which would have been denied him if he had merely been a matter of being angry with him for a few days. But she heard my father coming from the dressing-room, where he had gone to take off his clothes, and to avoid the scene that he would make if he saw me, she said in a voice half stifled by anger, Go to your room at once. Don't let your father see you standing there like an idiot. But I begged her again to come and say good night to me, terrified as I saw the light from my father's candle already creeping up the wall, but also making use of his approach as a means of blackmail, in the hope that my mother, not wishing him to find me there, as find me he must if she continued to refuse, would say to me, Go back to your room, I will come. Too late. My father was upon us. Instinctively I murmured, though no one heard me, "I am done for." I was not, however. My father used constantly to refuse to let me do things that were quite clearly allowed by the more liberal charters granted me by my mother and grandmother, because he paid no heed to principles, and because in his sight there were no such things as rights of man. For some quite irrelevant reason, or for no reason at all, he would at the last minute prevent me from taking some particular walk, one so regular and so consecrated to my use that to deprive me of it was a clear breach of faith. Or, again, as he would have done this evening, long before the appointed hour, he would say to me, "Run along to bed now, no excuses." But then again, because he had no principles, in my grandmother's sense, he could not, properly speaking, be called intransigent. He looked at me for a moment with an air of surprise and annoyance, and then, when Mamma had told him, not without some embarrassment, what had happened, said to her, "Go along with him. You said just now that you didn't feel like sleep, so stay in his room for a little while. I don't need anything." "But dear," my mother said timidly, "whether or not I feel like sleep is not the point. We must not make the child accustomed." "There's no question of making him accustomed," said my father with a shrug of his shoulders. "You can see quite well that the child is unhappy. After all, we aren't torturers. You'll end by making him ill, and a lot of good that will do. Since there are 2 beds in his room, tell Francoise to make up the big one for you, and stay beside him for the rest of the night. Well, good night. I'm not so nervous like you two. I'm going to bed." It was impossible for me to thank my father. What he had called my sentimentality would have exasperated him. I stood there not daring to move. He was still confronting us, a towering figure in his white nightshirt, crowned with the pink and violet scarf of Indian cashmere, in which, since he had begun to suffer from neuralgia, he used to tie up his head, standing like Abraham in the engraving after Benozzo Gozzoli that M. Swann had given me, telling Sarah that she must tear herself away from Isaac. Many years have passed since that night. The wall of the staircase, up which I had watched the light of his candle gradually climb, was long ago demolished, and in myself, too, many things have perished that I imagined would last forever, and new structures have arisen, giving birth to new sorrows and new joys which in those days I could not have foreseen, just as now the old have become difficult to comprehend. It's a long time ago, too, since my father has been able to tell Mamma to go with the child. Never again will such hours be possible for me. But of late, I have been increasingly able to catch, if I listen attentively, the sound of the sobs that I had the strength to control in my father's presence, and that broke out only when I found myself alone with Mamma. In reality, their echo has never ceased, and it is only because life is now growing more and more quiet around me that I hear them afresh, like those convent bells that are so effectively drowned out during the day by the noises of the street that one would suppose to have been stopped forever, until they sound out again through the silent evening air. Mamma spent that night in my room, when I had just committed a sin so deadly that I was waiting to be banished from the household. My parents gave me a far greater concession than I would have won as the reward of a good action. Even at that moment when it manifested itself in this crowning mercy, my father's conduct toward me was still somewhat arbitrary, and regardless of my deserts, as was characteristic of him and due to the fact that his actions were generally dictated by chance expediencies rather than based on any formal plan. And perhaps even what I call his strictness when he sent me off to bed deserved that title less, really, than my mother's or my grandmother's attitude, for his nature, which in some respects differed more than theirs from my own, had probably prevented him from guessing, until then, how wretched I was every evening, a thing that my mother and grandmother knew well. But they loved me enough to be unwilling to spare that suffering, which they hoped to teach me to overcome, so as to reduce my nervous sensibility and to strengthen my will. As for my father, whose affection for me was of another kind, I doubt he would have shown so much courage. For as soon as he had grasped the fact that I was unhappy, he said to my mother, "Go and comfort him." Mamma stayed all night in my room, and as though not to allow any recrimination to spoil those hours, so different from anything that I had a right to expect, when Françoise, realizing that something extraordinary must have happened when she saw Mamma sitting by my side, holding my hand and letting me cry without scolding me, said to her, "But, madam, what is young master?" Mamma replied, "Why, Françoise, he doesn't know himself. It is his nerves. Make up the bed for me quickly, and then go off to your own." And thus, for the first time, my unhappiness was regarded no longer as a fault for which I must be punished, but as an involuntary evil that had been officially recognized as a nervous condition, for which I was in no way responsible. I had the consolation that I need no longer mingle apprehensive scruples with the bitterness of my tears. I could weep henceforth without sin. I also felt no small degree of pride in Françoise's presence at this return to humane conditions, which, not an hour after Mamma had refused to come up to my room, and had sent the disdainful message that I was to go to sleep, raised me to the dignity of a grown-up person, brought me of a sudden to a sort of puberty of sorrow, to emancipation from tears. I ought then to have been happy. I was not. It seemed to me that my mother had just made a first concession, which must have been painful to her, that it was a first step down from the ideal she had formed for me, and that for the first time she, with all her courage, had to confess herself beaten. It struck me that if I had scored just a victory, it was over her that I had succeeded, as sickness or sorrow or age might have succeeded, in relaxing her will, in altering her judgment, that this evening opened a new era, must remain a black date in the calendar, and, if I had dared now, I would have said to Mamma, "No, I don't want you, you mustn't sleep here." But I was conscious of the practical wisdom, of what would be called nowadays the realism, with which she tempered my grandmother's ardent idealism, and I knew that now that the harm was done, she would prefer to let me enjoy the soothing pleasure of her company and not disturb my father. Certainly my mother's beautiful face seemed to shine again with youth that evening, as she sat gently holding my hands, trying to stop my tears. But for just that reason, it seemed to me that this should not have happened. Her anger would have made me less sad than this new kindness that my childhood had not known. I felt that I had, with an impious and secret finger, traced a first wrinkle on her soul, and made the first white hair show on her head. This thought redoubled my sobs. And then I saw that Mamma, who had never allowed herself to go to any length of tenderness with me, was suddenly overcome by my own, and had to struggle to keep back her tears. Then, as she saw that I had noticed this, she said to me with a laugh, "Why, my little buttercup, my little chick, he's going to make Mamma as silly as himself if this goes on. Look, since you aren't sleepy, and Mamma isn't either, we mustn't go on upsetting ourselves this way. We must do something. Let's get out one of your books." But I had none there. "Would it displease you if I get out the books now that your grandmother's going to give you for your birthday? Just think it over first. You won't be disappointed if there's nothing new for you then." I was only too delighted, and Mamma went to find a parcel of books in which I could distinguish through the paper in which they were wrapped only its short and broad side, but which, even at its first glimpse, brief and obscure as it was, eclipsed already the paint-box and the silkworms of New Year's Day. It contained La Mère Double, Françoise Leschamps, La Petite Fadette, and Les Maîtres Sonneurs. My grandmother, as I learned afterward, had at first chosen Musette's Poems, a volume of Rousseau and Indiana, for which she considered light reading as unwholesome as sweets and cakes, but she did not think that the strong breath of genius might have had on the mind of even of a child of influence more dangerous and less vivifying than those of fresh air and sea breezes on his body. But when my father had seemed almost to regard her as insane on learning the names of the books she proposed to give me, she had returned by herself to Joie le Vicomte, to the booksellers, so that there would be no fear of my not having my present in time. It was a burning hot day, and she had come home so unwell that the doctor had warned my mother not to allow her again to tire herself that way, and had there fallen back on the 4 pastoral novels of Georges Sand. "My dear," she said to Mamma, "I could not allow myself to give the child anything that was not well written." The truth was that she could not allow herself to purchase anything from which no intellectual profit was to be derived, and above all that profit which good things bestow on us by teaching us to seek our pleasures elsewhere than in the barren satisfaction of worldly wealth. Even when she had to make someone a present of the kind called useful, when she had to give an armchair or some table silver or a walking stick, she would choose antiques, as though their long desuetude had effaced from them any semblance of utility, and fitted them rather to instruct us in the lives of the men of other days, than to serve the common requirements of our own. She would have liked me to have in my rooms photographs of historical monuments or of the most beautiful places, but at the moment of buying them, and for all the subject of the picture that had an aesthetic value of its own, she would find that vulgarity and utility had too prominent a part in them, through the mechanical nature of their reproduction by photography. She attempted by a subterfuge, if not to eliminate altogether their commercial banality, at least to minimize it, to substitute for the bulk of what it was still art, to introduce, as it might be, several thicknesses of art instead, of photographs of Chartres Cathedral, or of the fountains of St. Cloud, or of Vesuvius. She would inquire of Swann whether some great painter had not made pictures of them, and prefer to give me photographs of Chartres Cathedral by Corot, of the fountains of St. Cloud by Hubert Robert, and of Vesuvius by Turner, which were a stage higher in the scale of art. But although the photographer had been prevented from reproducing directly the masterpieces or the beauties of nature, and had there been replaced by a great artist, he resumed his odious position when it came to reproducing the artist's interpretation. Accordingly, having to reckon again with vulgarity, my grandmother would endeavor to postpone the moment of contact still further. She would ask Swann if the picture had not been engraved, preferring, when possible, old engravings with some interest of association apart from themselves, for example, those that show us a masterpiece in a state in which we can no longer see it today, as Morgan's print of the Last Supper by Leonardo, before it was spoiled by restoration. It must be said that the results of this method of interpreting the art of giving presents were not always happy. The idea that I formed of Venice from a drawing by Titian, which is supposed to have the lagoon in the background, was certainly far less accurate than I would have derived from ordinary photographs. We could no longer keep count in the family. When my great-aunt tried to draw up an indictment of my grandmother, all of the armchairs she had presented to married couples, young and old, which on a first attempt to sit down on them had at once collapsed beneath the weight of their recipient. But my grandmother would have thought it petty to concern herself too closely with the solidity of any piece of furniture, in which could still be discerned a flourish, a smile, a fine conceit of the past. Even what, in such pieces, answered a material need, since it did so in a manner in which we are no longer accustomed, was as charming to her as one of those old forms of speech, in which we can still see traces of a metaphor, whose fine point has been worn away by the rough usage of our modern tongue. In precisely the same way, the pastoral novels of Georges Sand, which she was giving me for my birthday, like a storehouse of antique furniture, were full of expressions that have fallen out of use and returned as imagery, such as one finds now only in country dialects. And my grandmother had bought them in preference to other books, just as she would have preferred to rent a house that had a Gothic dovecote or some other piece of antiquity that would have had a favorable influence on the mind, filling it with a nostalgic longing for impossible journeys through the realms of time. Mamma sat down by my bed. She had chosen Françoise Leschamp, whose reddish color and incomprehensible title gave it a distinct personality in my eyes and a mysterious attraction. I had not then read any real novels. I had heard that George Sand was a typical novelist, and that prepared me in advance to imagine that Françoise Leschamps contained something indefinable and delicious. The narrative devices intended to arouse curiosity or melt to pity certain modes of expression that disturb or sadden, and that a reader with a little experience recognizes as common to many novels, seemed to me then distinctive. For to me, a new book was not one of a number of similar objects, but was like a person, unmatched, and with no cause of existence beyond himself, an intoxicating whiff of the particular essence of Françoise Leschamps. Beneath the everyday incidences, the commonplace things and banal words, I could overhear an intonation, a strange accentuation. The action began. To me it seemed all the more obscure because in those days, when I read to myself, I used often for entire pages to daydream of something quite different. And to the gaps that this distinction made in my knowledge of the story more were added, in that when it was Mamma who was reading to me aloud, she left out all the love scenes. And so all the odd changes that take place in the relations between the miller's wife and the boy, changes that only birth and growth of love can explain, seemed to me sealed in a profound mystery, the key to which, as I could readily believe, lay in that strange and pleasant-sounding name of Champy, which draped the boy who bore it, I know not why, in its own bright colour, crimson and charming. If my mother was not a faithful reader, she was none the less admirable when reading a work, in which she found the note of true feeling by the respectful simplicity of her interpretation, and by the sound of her sweet and gentle voice. It was the same in her daily life. When it was not works of art, but men and women whom she moved to pity or admire, it was touching to observe with what deference she would banish from her voice, her gestures, from her whole conversation, now the note of joy that might have distressed some mother who had long ago lost a child, now the recollection of an event or an anniversary have reminded some old gentleman of the burden of his years. Now the household topic that might have bored some young man of letters. And so, when she read aloud the prose of George Sand, prose that is everywhere redolent of the kindness and moral distinction that Mamma had learned from my grandmother to place above all other qualities in life, and which I was not to teach her until much later to refrain from placing in the same way above all other qualities in literature, taking pains to banish from her voice any weakness or affectation that might have blocked its channel for that powerful stream of language. She supplied all the natural tenderness, all the abundant sweetness that they demanded to phrases that seemed to have been composed for her voice, and that were all, so to speak, entirely within the range of her sensibility. She found to attack them in a tone that they required, the cordial accent that pre-exists them and dictated them, but which is not indicated by the words themselves, and by means of this accent she smoothed away as she read on any harshness there might have been in the tenses of verbs, endowing the imperfect and the preiterite with all the sweetness that there is in kindness, all the melancholy that there is in love. Guided the sentence that was drawing to an end toward the one that was waiting to begin, now hastening, now slackening the pace of syllables, so as to bring them, despite their difference in quantity, into a uniform rhythm, and breathe into this quite ordinary prose a kind of life, continuous and full of feeling. My remorse was soothed. I abandoned myself to the sweetness of this night when I had my mother by my side. I knew that such a night could not be repeated, that the strongest desire I had in the world, namely to keep my mother in my room through the sad hours of darkness, ran too much counter to general requirements and to the wishes of others for such a concession as had been granted me this evening to be anything other than random and exceptional. Tomorrow night my anguish would resume, and Mamma would not stay by my side. But when my anguish grew calm, I could no longer understand the reason for it. Besides, tomorrow evening was still a long way off. I told myself that I would still have time to think things over, although that remission of time would bring me no additional power, since it was a question of things that did not depend on the exercise of my will, and that only seemed more avoidable due to the short interval that separated them from me. And so it was, that for a long time afterward, when I lay awake at night and revived old memories of Combray, I saw no more of it than this sort of luminous panel, sharply defined against a vague and shadowy background, like the panels that a Bengal light or some electric sign will illuminate and dissect from the front of a building, the other parts of which remain plunged in darkness. Broad enough at its base, the little parlor, the dining room, the alluring shadows of the path along which would come Swann, the unconscious author of my sufferings. The hall through which I would journey to the first step of that staircase, so cruel to climb, which constituted all by itself the very narrow trunk of an irregular pyramid, and at the summit, my bedroom, with the little hall, through whose door with glass panels Mamma would enter. In a word, seen always at the same evening hour, isolated from all its possible surroundings, detached and solitary against its shadowy background, the bare minimum of scenery necessary, like the scene location one sees printed at the top of the title page of an old play, for its performance in the provinces. To the drama of my undressing, as though all Combray had consisted of but 2 floors joined by a slender staircase, and as though there had been no time there but 7 o'clock at night. To tell the truth, I could have answered anyone who asked that Combray did include other scenes and did exist at other hours than these. But since what I would have then remembered about it would have been furnished me by voluntary memory, the memory of intelligence, and since the pictures which that kind of memory shows us of the past preserve nothing of the past itself, I would never have any wish to ponder over this residue of Combray. To me, it was in reality all dead. Dead forever? Very possibly. There is a large element of chance in these matters, and a second chance, that of our own death, often prevents us from awaiting for any length of time the favors of the first. I feel that there is much to be said for the Celtic belief that the souls of those whom we have lost are held captive in some inferior being, in an animal, in a plant, in some inanimate object, and so effectively lost to us until the day, which to many never comes, when we happen to pass by the tree, or to obtain possession of the object that forms their prison. Then they start and tremble, and they call us by our name, and as soon as we have recognized their voice, the spell is broken. Delivered by us, they have overcome death, and return to share our life. And so it is with our own past. It is a labor in vain to attempt to recapture it. All the efforts of our intellect must prove futile. The past is hidden somewhere outside the realm, beyond the reach of intellect, in some material object, in the sensation which that material object will give us, which we do not suspect. And as for that object, it depends on chance whether we come upon it or not, before we ourselves must die. Many years had lapsed during which nothing of Combray, save what was comprised in the theatre and the drama of my going to bed there, had any existence for me, when one day in winter, as I came home, my mother, seeing that I was cold, offered me some tea, a thing I did not ordinarily take. I declined at first, and then, I don't know why, changed my mind. She sent out for one of those short, plump little cakes called petites madeleines, which look as though they had been molded in a fluted scallop of a pilgrim's shell. And soon, mechanically, weary after a dismal day with the prospect of a depressing morrow, I raised to my lips a spoonful of the tea in which I had soaked a morsel of the madeleine. No sooner had the warm liquid mixed with the crumbs of the cake touched my palate than a shudder ran through my whole body. I stopped, intent on the extraordinary changes that were taking place in me. An exquisite pleasure had invaded my senses, but individual, detached, with no suggestion of its origin. At once, the vicissitudes of life had become indifferent to me, its desires innocuous, its brevity illusory. this new sensation having had on me the effect that love has of filling me with a precious essence, or rather, this essence was not in me, it was me. I had ceased to feel mediocre, contingent, mortal. Whence could it have come to me, this all-powerful joy? I sensed that it was connected with the sense of tea and cake, but that it infinitely transcended those savours, could not be of the same nature. Whence did it come? What did it signify? How could I grasp it? I drink a second mouthful, in which I find nothing more than in the first, a third, which gives me rather less than the second. It is time for me to stop. The power of the drink seems to be diminishing. It is clear that the object of my quest, the truth, lies not in me, in it, but in me. The tea has called it up in me, but does not itself understand, and can only repeat indefinitely with a gradual loss of strength the same testimony which I too cannot interpret, though I hope at least to be able to call upon the tea for it again, and to find it there intact, and at my disposal for my final enlightenment. I put down my cup and examine my own mind. It alone must discover the truth. But how? What an abyss of uncertainty whenever the mind senses that some part of it has strayed beyond its own borders, when it, the seeker, is at once the dark region through which it must go seeking, where all its equipment will avail it nothing. Seek? More than that. Create. It is face to face with something that does not yet exist, to which it alone can give reality and substance, which it alone can bring into the light of day. And I begin again to ask myself what it could have been, this unknown state which brought with it no logical proof of its existence, but only the sense that it was a happy, a real state in whose presence the other states of consciousness vanished. I decided to attempt to make it reappear. I retrace my thoughts to the moment at which I drank the first spoonful of tea. I find again the same state, illumined by no fresh light. I ask my mind to make another effort to bring back one more time the fleeting sensation, and so that nothing may interrupt the course in which my mind will try to recapture that sensation, I shut out every obstacle, every extraneous idea. I stop my ears and inhibit all my attention to the sounds that come from the next room. But feeling that my mind is growing fatigued without any success, I compel it for a change, to accept the distraction which I have just denied it, to think of other things, to rest and refresh itself before the ultimate attempt. And then, for the second time, I clear an empty space in front of it. I place in position before it the still recent taste of that first mouthful, and I feel something start within me, something that leaves its resting place and attempts to rise, something that has been embedded like an anchor at a great depth. I do not know yet what it is, but I can feel it mounting slowly. I can measure the resistance, and I can hear the echo of great spaces traversed. Undoubtedly, what is thus palpitating in the depths of my being must be the image, the visual memory which, being linked to that taste, has tried to follow it into my conscious mind. But its struggles are too far off, too much confused. Scarcely can I perceive the colourless reflection in which they are blended, the uncapturable whirling medley of radiant hues. But I cannot distinguish its form, cannot ask it, as the one possible interpreter, to translate for me the evidence of its contemporary, its inseparable companion, the taste of cake soaked in tea, cannot ask it to inform me what particular circumstances in question, of what period in my past life. Will it ultimately reach the clear surface of my consciousness, this memory, this old dead memory, which the attraction of an identical moment has travelled so far to summon, to move, to raise up out of the very depths of my being? I do not know. Now I feel nothing. It has stopped, has perhaps gone down again into its darkness, from which who can say whether or not it will ever rise? 10 times over I must try again, must lean down over the abyss, and each time the natural laziness that deters us from every difficult task, every work of importance, has urged me to leave the thing alone, to drink my tea, and to think merely of the worries of today and of my hopes for tomorrow, which let themselves be pondered over without effort or distress of mind. And suddenly the memory appears before me. The taste was of that little morsel of Madeleine that on Sunday mornings at Combray, because on those mornings I did not go out before the time for Mass, when I went to say good morning to her in her bedroom, my Aunt Leonie used to give me, dipping it first in her own cup of real or of lime blossom tea. The sight of that little Madeleine had recalled nothing to my mind before I tasted it. Perhaps because I had so often seen such things in the interval without tasting them, on pastry cooks' trays, that their image had left those Combray days to take its place among others more recent. Perhaps, because of those memories, so long abandoned and put out of mind, nothing had survived, everything was scattered. The forms of things, including that of the little scallop shell of pastry, so richly sensual under its severe religious folds, were either obliterated or had been so long dormant as to have lost the power of expansion that would have allowed them to resume their place in my consciousness. But when from a long distant past nothing subsists, after the people are dead, after the things are broken and scattered, still alone, more fragile but with more vitality, more unsubstantial, more persistent, more faithful, the smell and taste of things remain poised a long time, like souls, remembering, waiting, hoping on the ruins of all the rest, bearing without faltering on the tiny and almost impalpable drop of their essence, the vast structure of memory. And once I had recognized the taste of the morsel of Madeleine dipped in the lime blossom tea that my aunt used to give me, although I did not yet know, and must long postpone the discovery of why this memory made me so happy. Immediately the old grey house on the street, where her room was, rose up like the scenery of a theatre to attach itself to the little pavilion, opening onto the garden, which had been built out behind it for my parents. The isolated panel, which, until that moment, had been all that I could see, and with the house, the town, from morning to night, and in all weathers, the square where I was sent before the midday meal, the streets along which I used to run errands, the country roads we took when the weather was fine. And just as the Japanese amuse themselves by filling a porcelain bowl with water and steeping in it little bits of paper which until then are without character or form, but the moment they become wet, stretch themselves and bend, take on color and distinctive shape, become flowers or houses or people, permanent and recognizable. So in that moment all the flowers in our garden, and in M. Swann's park, and the water lilies on Vivonne, and the good folk of the village and their little dwellings, and the parish church, and the whole of Combray and of its surroundings, taking their proper shapes and growing solid, sprang into being, town and gardens